They lived in a place most people in the world didn't even know existed. A small village far from the noise of big cities, far from highways, and far from the light of neon signs. Nights there were dark, so dark that when you looked up, the sky didn't just have stars, it looked like a whole ocean of fireflies waiting to listen. For the people who lived in that village, the stars weren't just lights, they were hope. They were silent listeners who had watched their joys, their births, their losses, and their endless waiting for help. Life had never been easy there. The land was rough, dry most of the year, and whatever grew from the soil came after backbreaking labor. But even then, the crops that grew were often not enough. Every harvest was smaller than the last, and in the past few years, things had only gotten worse. Rain that once came like a blessing now rarely touched the ground. The river that children once played in had shrunk into nothing more than a stream of dust. The wells were tired, and pulling water out of them was like begging an old man to speak when he no longer had the strength. People were strong, yes. They were used to surviving, but survival has its limits. Every day started with tired bodies waking up before sunrise, and every night ended with eyes that searched the skies, wondering if someone, somewhere was listening. Mothers carried their children with worry in their hearts, watching their little ones grow thinner. Elders who once told stories of good harvests and plentiful rains now sat silently, their words caught in their throats. It was not just hunger. It was the weight of silence, the feeling that they had been forgotten. And so they turned where humans have always turned in times of despair, to something bigger than themselves, to something they could not see but could always feel above them, the stars. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the villagers gathered in the open field near the center of their homes. It wasn't the first time they gathered there, but that evening was different. It was heavier, more desperate. Families sat together, children clinging to their parents, elders leaning on walking sticks, and farmers with hands roughened by years of digging into the soil. The air was dry and still, as if the whole world was holding its breath with them. They lifted their eyes upward. There above them stretched an endless canvas of stars, bright, silent, unmoving. The villagers spoke not in shouts but in whispers that grew into cries. They begged for rain, for food, for some sign that they were not alone. Some prayed quietly, rocking back and forth, while others raised their arms toward the sky as if trying to catch a piece of its light in their palms. A woman, her voice cracking with exhaustion, pleaded for her child's health. A farmer whispered to the stars, asking only for enough rain to keep the soil alive. An elder, his voice trembling, asked for strength for the younger ones so they could continue living in the land that their ancestors once promised them. Their words floated upward into the night air, weaving into something larger than themselves. There was no sound in return. Only the night insects sang and the stars kept shining as they always had. Yet in that silence, the villagers felt something, a kind of connection, as though the sky itself was leaning down to listen. That feeling was enough to keep their voices rising, one after another, until the whole village was echoing with a plea that could have broken even the hardest heart. For hours they stayed like that, speaking to the heavens until voices grew hoarse and children fell asleep in their parents' arms. But even then, they did not leave right away. They lingered, staring upward, as though afraid that walking away would mean the stars would stop listening. It was not the first time humans had begged the heavens for help, and it would not be the last. But on that night something felt different. The desperation was raw, almost alive. You could almost feel the energy vibrating in the air, like the earth itself had heard them too. When the villagers finally returned to their homes, silence spread across the fields. The stars were still there, unchanged, steady as always. But down below in the hearts of the people, a new seed had been planted. Hope mixed with fear. They had asked, they had begged, they had sent their cries out into the endless sky, and now all that was left was to wait. Waiting, however, can be the heaviest burden of all. The villagers woke the next day and carried on with their lives, watering the dying fields, searching for wild herbs to eat, comforting one another when words of comfort barely existed. But the memory of that night did not fade. Every glance at the stars reminded them of what they had asked for. Every silence in the wind reminded them of what they were waiting for. Children asked their parents, "Will the stars help us?" Parents answered with voices they tried to keep steady, though their own hearts wavered. Elders told the children to have faith, even though they too were unsure. But beneath all the uncertainty, hope burned quietly. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the sky would answer. As the nights went on, the gatherings continued, each one more desperate than the last. Sometimes they sang old songs, their voices trembling as they rose into the sky. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, letting their hearts speak louder than words. The stars, always watching, gave no clear reply. Yet the villagers kept speaking, kept begging, for in their hearts giving up was not an option. And then something began to change. It was small at first. Subtle. The kind of thing you might ignore if you weren't paying attention. The wind, which had been still for weeks, began to shift strangely at night. Shadows stretched in unusual ways across the fields, as though the moonlight itself had grown restless. The animals in the village, dogs, goats, even the birds started behaving oddly, watching the skies as if they too sensed something stirring. The villagers didn't know it yet, but their cries had been heard. Not in the way they had hoped, not by the stars they had begged, but something somewhere had listened, and it was already on its way. The first signs came quietly, almost gently, as if the world was trying to whisper something before raising its voice. At first, nobody paid much attention. In a place where life had always been uncertain, small changes didn't feel unusual. But soon those changes began to weave themselves together, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. One evening, as the villagers gathered in the fields, the air seemed heavier than usual. A warm wind swept across the land, even though the day had been cool. The people looked up, thinking perhaps rain was finally on its way. But there were no clouds. The sky was clear, too clear, and the stars shone with an unusual sharpness, as if they were pressing closer to the earth. The villagers whispered among themselves. Some smiled, saying this must be the answer to their prayers. Others stayed quiet, unsure. They wanted to believe, but there was something unsettling about the stillness, the way the night seemed to be watching them back. In the days that followed, more strange things began to happen. The fields, which had been drying out for months, suddenly shifted in ways that no one could explain. Small patches of earth grew darker, as though something beneath the soil was stirring. The wind blew at odd times, carrying with it sounds that felt almost like distant voices. And the animals. Oh, the animals were the first to truly notice. Goats refused to graze in areas they had always gone to before. Dogs barked at the empty air, their fur bristling as though they saw shapes the human eye could not. Birds that once circled lazily in the sky now darted away suddenly, scattering in fear from something unseen. At first, the villagers told themselves these were blessings, signs that the heavens were preparing a gift. They remembered the night when they had lifted their voices together, begging the stars for help, and they convinced themselves that what they saw now was proof their prayers had been heard. The elders told stories to keep hope alive. They said perhaps the sky spirits had sent signs to prepare them for change. Mothers hushed their children with gentle words, saying, "Don't be afraid. This means help is coming." Even the farmers, who had grown weary of false promises, started to feel a spark of faith. But then, the blessings turned bitter. The crops, instead of growing stronger, began to wither faster. Leaves curled, turning from green to brown almost overnight. In the middle of the night, some villagers swore they heard rustling in the fields, louder than the sound of wind. When they went out to investigate, they found stalks of corn broken as if something heavy had moved through them. One morning, a family discovered their goat missing. Its tether was still tied, but the rope had snapped, frayed at the edges as though it had been yanked with sudden force. They searched for hours but found no trace. A day later, another family lost 2 chickens in the same mysterious way. It became a pattern. Animals vanishing without warning, their tracks disappearing into the earth as if swallowed whole. Fear began to creep into conversations. People still wanted to believe this was the work of the stars, but the signs grew darker each night. A farmer returning home late swore he saw a tall shadow cross the path in front of him, even though there was no one around. Another villager claimed that when he bent down to fetch water, he felt something brush against his leg in the empty well. He laughed it off in public, but his trembling hands gave him away. Children who once laughed under the night sky now hid their faces in their parents' shoulders. They whispered about shapes moving near the forest edge, about glowing eyes watching them from the dark. Their parents told them it was only imagination, but deep inside they too were uneasy. And still the people gathered in the open fields at night. Still, they lifted their eyes to the stars. They told themselves they must remain patient. Help does not come instantly. Help takes time. But in the silence of their hearts, some wondered if they had made a mistake. As the strange events multiplied, the village grew restless. The line between faith and fear grew thinner each day. Some believed these were trials sent to test their strength before the blessing arrived. Others whispered that perhaps the heavens had misunderstood their pleas. One evening, as the sun sank into a deep red horizon, the villagers noticed something that shook them more than anything before. A low humming sound drifted across the fields. It was faint at first, so soft that you might confuse it with the buzzing of insects. But as night fell, the sound grew louder, more persistent, filling the air like a song without words. People stepped outside their homes, gathering in small groups, listening. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not music, but it carried a rhythm, a pulse that made the ground feel alive. Some clutched their chests, feeling the vibration deep inside their bones. The children cried, saying the stars were speaking. The elders raised their eyes and nodded slowly, saying, "This is it. The answer has come." But not everyone agreed. A few felt unease, the kind that makes the hair on your arms rise. Something in that sound didn't feel like comfort. It felt like warning. The days that followed were heavy with tension. People worked in their fields but kept glancing over their shoulders. They went about their routines but with a sense of waiting, as if holding their breath for something unseen. Even laughter felt forced, quickly fading into silence. And then came the night that sealed their doubts. The villagers had gathered again beneath the stars, their voices soft, their hope still clinging despite the strange events. As they prayed, a sudden gust of wind swept through, colder and sharper than any they had felt before. The flames in their lanterns flickered wildly, some blowing out entirely. And in that darkness, several villagers swore they saw figures moving in the fields, shadows that did not belong to any human. The shapes did not come closer. They lingered at a distance, melting into the tall grass, their outlines barely visible. But the eyes, people spoke later of eyes that gleamed faintly, reflecting the starlight, watching in complete silence. Panic spread. Parents clutched their children and hurried back to their homes. The elders, who had always spoken of patience, fell silent, their faces pale. The prayers ended abruptly that night. No one dared stay in the field any longer. The village was changing. The stars above still shone as they always had, calm and untouched. But below, the people who had once begged for help now felt a new kind of fear. They had asked, they had waited, and they had seen signs. But now they wondered what exactly had answered them. The hope that had kept them alive was beginning to break, like a clay pot with cracks too deep to mend. And in those cracks, fear was seeping in, stronger every day. The first time they realized something was truly wrong, it was not because of the sky. It was because of the ground. For days, the strange hum in the air had unsettled everyone, but life in the village had to go on. People still had to fetch water, care for the few animals that remained, and tend to what little was left in the fields. But then one morning, a group of children ran into the village square, their voices trembling with fear. They said something had moved in the far field, something large, bigger than any animal they had ever seen. The adults at first dismissed it as imagination. Children often let fear shape their eyes, but when the men went to look, they returned without words. Their silence was heavier than any explanation. Whatever they had seen out there, they did not want to describe in front of the others. That night, people barely slept. They heard noises beyond the fields, branches snapping, low growls, and sometimes the sound of many feet moving quickly over the soil. The animals in the village barked and bleated all night long, until their voices were hoarse with terror. The next morning, the truth could no longer be hidden. The fields looked as though something had passed through them in the night. Crops were trampled, stalks bent, and the soil was disturbed in deep, uneven lines, almost like claw marks. One family found feathers scattered near their fence, not belonging to any bird they knew. The villagers gathered in confusion. Some whispered that these were signs of heavenly beings descending, but others shook their heads. "Heavenly beings do not leave marks like this," one of the elders muttered. His words spread fear like fire through dry grass. By the third night, no one doubted it anymore. The monsters had arrived. It started with the wolves. The villagers had always known wolves existed in the distant mountains, but they had never come this close. They usually stayed far away, hunting in their own lands. But now, packs of them appeared at the edge of the fields, their glowing eyes watching in silence. The villagers lit fires to keep them away, but the wolves did not run. They only stood, waiting, their shapes shifting in the dark. Soon after, more creatures came, wild dogs, larger than normal, their ribs showing yet their eyes burning with strange energy. They roamed the outskirts, snapping at the air, their howls mixing with the cries of the wolves. Flocks of crows circled the skies during the day, their numbers so thick they covered the sun for moments at a time. And when the villagers thought they had seen everything, swarms of locusts appeared, devouring anything green that remained in the fields. It was as if the earth itself had opened its doors and released everything that could terrify the human heart. The villagers tried to protect themselves. They built stronger fences. They tied their animals closer. They took turns staying awake at night to guard the fields, but each effort failed. Goats were taken right from behind fences. Chickens disappeared without a trace. And even the strongest men admitted they felt powerless against the numbers. What frightened them most was not only the presence of these creatures, but the way they seemed guided by something unseen. Wolves and dogs, normally enemies, now moved side by side. Birds circled above just as the wolves prowled below. Insects swarmed only after the crops had weakened. It felt too precise, too deliberate, as if the village was being surrounded piece by piece. The people who had once lifted their hands to the stars now lowered them, pressing their palms against their faces in despair. They had begged for help, and instead the earth had answered with monsters. But even in the midst of fear, life demanded choices. Some villagers wanted to leave, to abandon the land and find safety elsewhere. But leaving was not easy. The nearest town was days away, and the path to it led through thick forests where the very creatures they feared now lurked. Others argued they must stay and fight, for this was the land of their ancestors, and running would mean losing everything they had ever known. Tension grew. Families argued behind closed doors. Neighbors who once worked side by side now avoided each other, each one fearing the other's decision might bring more danger. The village, once bound together by hope, was now cracking under the weight of fear. And then came the first true attack. One night, while the villagers huddled in their homes, a piercing cry echoed from the edge of the settlement. A young man who had been keeping watch shouted for help. By the time others reached him, he was gone. Only the broken spear he had carried lay on the ground, its wooden shaft splintered. The soil around it was torn and scattered, as though many feet had struggled there. The village erupted in panic. No one wanted to speak of what might have happened, but everyone knew the truth. The monsters had not only come for their animals and crops. Now they were coming for them. That night, no one slept. Fires burned in every corner of the village. Shadows danced across walls, and the sound of distant howling filled the air like a curse. Children cried into their mothers' arms, and even the strongest men admitted they had never felt so powerless. Days turned into weeks, and the attacks continued. Sometimes it was livestock. Sometimes it was crops. Sometimes it was simply the terror of glowing eyes watching from the fields, never stepping closer, yet never leaving. The people no longer gathered in the fields to pray. They no longer looked at the stars with hope. Instead, they looked at the ground, at the forests, at the shadows where danger lurked. The stars, which once represented comfort, now seemed cruel in their silence. Some elders said this was a punishment, that perhaps the people had asked for too much, begged too loudly. Others said the heavens had sent their help in a way the villagers could not understand. But for the younger ones, the explanation did not matter. All they saw was that they had asked for light, and instead, darkness had come. The monsters of the earth were here, and they were not leaving. Yet beneath the fear, a quiet strength began to grow. The villagers realized that waiting for the stars to save them would not be enough. They would have to stand against what had come, no matter how terrifying, no matter how impossible. What they did not know was that the struggle had only just begun. The nights grew longer, or at least they felt that way. Fear stretched every hour into something heavy, something unbearable. The people of the village had once lived with silence, but now silence itself became their enemy. Every quiet moment carried the weight of what might come next. Footsteps outside, howls in the dark, or the sudden rustle of something moving through the crops. But in the face of fear, humans do what they have always done. They adapt. They gather strength even when their bodies are tired. They fight, even when they don't know if they can win. The villagers began to prepare. No longer were the nightly gatherings about prayers to the stars. Now they gathered to plan. Men and women sat together, discussing ways to protect their homes, their families, and whatever little food remained. The first thing they did was build barriers. They cut down trees from the edge of the forest and carried the heavy logs back into the village. Together, they created makeshift walls and fences around their homes, digging the logs deep into the ground so they would not fall. The younger ones carried stones, piling them high to create layers of defense. It was not perfect, but it gave them something they had been missing for weeks: purpose. Then came the watch groups. Instead of leaving 1 or 2 people to guard, the villagers divided into teams. Each night, while some slept, others stayed awake, holding torches and standing at the edge of the barriers. Their job was not only to protect, but also to warn. If anything moved near the fields, they would sound the alarm by banging pots or blowing into hollow horns made from wood. It was exhausting work. Many villagers went days with little rest, their eyes red from sleepless nights. But still they pushed on. For the first time since the strange events had begun, they felt united. Old disagreements and rivalries that had once divided families suddenly disappeared. In the face of fear, they were one people, but the monsters of the earth did not give them peace. The wolves returned, this time bolder. They circled the village at night, their eyes glowing in the firelight. They tested the new barriers, pressing against the logs, clawing at the edges. The villagers held their ground, shouting and throwing stones until the wolves pulled back. For the first time, the people did not run. They stood together, hearts pounding, torches raised high. The next challenge came from the skies. The flocks of crows grew larger, swooping down on the village during the day, stealing food and frightening the children. The villagers responded by hanging shiny objects from strings, broken pots, bits of metal, anything that could catch the sunlight and scare the birds away. They waved sticks, banged on drums, and even lit small fires in the fields to keep the flocks at a distance. Then there were the insects. The swarms of locusts came without warning, sweeping over the land like a living cloud. They chewed through the remaining crops, leaving behind bare stalks and dust. The villagers tried to fight them by waving cloths and smoke, but the insects were too many. At times, the people simply stood in silence, watching as the last of their harvest disappeared before their eyes. Yet, despite the losses, they refused to give up. "If the earth has sent us its monsters," one elder said, "then we must show the earth we will not break." His words spread through the village like fire. Each person clung to them, repeating them in moments of weakness. The children were the ones who changed the most. At first, they had been terrified, hiding behind their parents during the long nights. But as the struggle went on, even the children began to help. They carried water for the watch groups, collected stones for the barriers, and sang songs to keep the others awake during their shifts. Their voices, small but brave, reminded everyone why they were fighting. Still, the weight of survival was heavy. Hunger grew sharper. Many nights, families shared only a handful of food among them. Sleep became a rare gift. Faces grew thinner and eyes grew hollow. But behind those eyes there was a fire that refused to die out. The greatest test came during a stormless night. The air was dry, the sky full of stars when the ground itself seemed to tremble. The villagers had gathered in silence, torches lit when they heard it. The sound of many feet moving quickly. From the darkness, shapes emerged. Wolves, wild dogs, and other creatures they could barely name. Together they moved toward the barriers, their growls filling the air. The alarm was sounded. Pots clanged, horns bellowed, children were rushed inside. The villagers lined up with sticks, stones, and torches. They shouted, banged, and waved fire, trying to drive the creatures back. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the monsters would break through. The logs shook under their weight, dust rising as claws tore at the edges. But the people did not run. They shouted louder, threw more stones, pushed back with all their strength. And slowly, painfully, the creatures withdrew. Their glowing eyes lingered for a long while in the dark before vanishing into the fields. When it was over, the villagers collapsed where they stood, too tired even to cheer. But in their exhaustion there was also pride. They had faced the monsters together and had not been broken. The next day the village looked different. The barriers still stood, though scarred. The people still had little food, though hunger gnawed at them. But there was a new strength in their steps, a new determination in their voices. They knew the monsters would return. They knew the struggle was far from over. But they also knew something else. something the stars had never told them, something the earth itself had forced them to learn. They were not powerless. In their unity, they had discovered a force stronger than fear, a force that no monster, no storm, no silence from the heavens could ever take away. It was not the help they had begged for. It was not the gift of the stars. It was something born from the ground beneath their feet, from the hearts beating in their chests. It was survival. And with that, they stood ready for whatever would come next. When the attacks began to slow, the people of the village did not celebrate right away. They had lived too many nights filled with fear to trust silence. Every creak of the fence, every distant howl, every rustle of the leaves kept them alert. But as days turned into weeks and no more creatures appeared at their barriers, they began to breathe differently. The monsters, it seemed, were gone. It did not happen in a single moment. There was no grand departure, no final storm of noise. The wolves that once circled the village simply stopped showing up. The birds that had filled the skies scattered into the distance and did not return. Even the strange hum in the air faded, leaving behind only the sound of wind moving softly through the empty fields. But though the danger had passed, the village was not the same. The fences still stood, scarred and broken from nights of struggle. The fields lay barren, the soil stripped of crops. The livestock, once the pride of many families, were few and weak. Hunger still pressed on them, and the silence left behind by the monsters felt almost heavier than their presence had been. The people themselves were changed too. Faces were thinner, voices quieter, but in their eyes lived a hardness, a fire that no wind could put out. They had survived something most could not even imagine, and though they carried scars, they also carried strength. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the villagers gathered once more in the open space where their prayers had first begun. It had been many weeks since they had stood together like that. For a moment it almost felt the same. The sky stretched wide above them, the stars shining brightly as always. Children leaned against their parents. Elders stood with hands folded, and the night wrapped itself around them like an old blanket. But this time, the feeling was different. They no longer looked at the stars with the same hope as before. The night sky was as beautiful as it had always been, yet there was something distant, something cold about it. They remembered how they had begged for help, lifting their voices until their throats ached. They remembered how they had waited, searching the skies for a sign. And they remembered what had come instead, not blessings from above, but monsters from the earth. The stars had never answered. Some spoke softly that night, reflecting on all that had happened. One elder said perhaps the stars had listened after all, but in their own way, teaching the people to find strength within themselves. Another shook his head, saying the stars had only been silent watchers, neither cruel nor kind, simply too far away to care. Others did not speak at all. They only stared upward, the memories too heavy for words. What everyone knew without speaking was this: it had not been the heavens that saved them. It had been their own hands, their own courage, their own unity. When the monsters had come, it was not light from above that drove them away. It was the fire they held in their torches, the stones they threw with trembling arms, the barriers they built with tired bodies. It was the voices of their children, singing in the dark to keep fear away. It was their own spirit, stubborn and unbroken. And so, though the sky remained the same, the people beneath it were forever changed. Life did not become easy after that. The fields needed time to heal, the animals needed time to grow, and the people needed time to rest. But they worked side by side, refusing to let despair root itself again. Slowly, green began to return to the land. Slowly, laughter began to return to the village, though always quieter than before, as if the people did not want to tempt fate. Children once again played outside, though they stayed closer to the village walls. Mothers told stories by the fire, but the tales now carried lessons of caution and strength. The elders, when asked about the stars, spoke carefully. They no longer promised that the heavens would bring answers. Instead, they said, "The stars will shine, but it is our own hands that must shape tomorrow." In time, the fear faded into memory, though it never fully disappeared. Even years later, when the fences had rotted away and the fields were green again, people still felt a shiver when the wind grew too still or the night too quiet. They remembered the glowing eyes in the dark, the hum that had filled the air, the feeling of being surrounded by forces beyond understanding. But with that memory also came pride. For they had not run. They had not broken, and though the stars had remained silent, the people had discovered something greater, the strength of their own hearts. One night, a young child looked up at the sky and asked her grandmother, "Will the stars ever help us if we ask again?" The old woman smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the light of the fire. "The stars will always listen," she said, "but help does not always come from above. Sometimes it comes from here." She touched the child's chest, right where the heart beat strong and steady. The child nodded, not fully understanding, but the words sank deep, like seeds waiting to grow, and so the story of the village was passed down, not just as a tale of fear and monsters, but as a lesson that prayers alone do not save, that the earth carries both beauty and terror, that the stars may watch, but it is the people who must rise. The villagers never forgot that long season of shadows, when the monsters of the earth came in answer to their cries, but they also never forgot what it had revealed. They had begged the stars for help. They had looked upward, desperate and broken, and in return the earth had sent its darkest tests. Yet in surviving those tests, they had found something the stars could never give them. They had found themselves, and so the nights in that village were never the same again. The people still looked at the stars, but not as helpless dreamers. They looked at them as equals, silent lights in the distance, beautiful but unreachable. And beneath that endless sky, the villagers walked forward, their steps steady, their hearts strong, knowing that the truest help had always been here on the earth, within their own hands. The stars had never promised salvation, but the people had learned a deeper truth. Sometimes salvation is not given, sometimes it is made.